Welcome to another episode of The Brand Called You, a podcast and podcast show that brings you leadership lessons, knowledge, experience, and wisdom from thousands of successful individuals from around the world. I'm your host, Ashutosh Garg, and today I'm privileged to welcome a very, very senior professional from Edinburgh, UK, Mr. Peter F. Gallagher. Peter, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Ash.
Peter is a change management global thought leader. He's an author of 12 books, his latest being Leadership of Change, and he has been named amongst the top 30 global leadership gurus. So, Peter, before we start talking leadership, tell me a little bit about your own journey.
So my journey, thank you very much for the introduction, Ash. My journey started many years ago, but where I am now, and I'll go backwards, I consult, speak, and write about the leadership of change. My purpose is to improve the leadership of change, and I help C-level leaders to successfully lead and deliver their organization's change, improvement, or transformation. For the last 30 years, I've worked in over 30 countries. I've been involved in aerospace, defense, energy, finance, manufacturing, and I've worked in organizations such as Shell, Ernst & Young, Bombardier Aerospace, and NCR. I've worked both as an internal and external consultant. I've been involved in manufacturing, procurement, quality, Lean Six Sigma initiatives, operational excellence, ERP implementation, CEO special projects, major organizational change and transformation. My clients have included some of the biggest companies in the world: Aramco, BP, Boeing, Rolls-Royce, General Electric, and Dow. But when I look back at the projects, and I did this a few years ago, Ash, I look back at the projects and programs I've been involved in, and I wanted to find out which ones were successful. And the ones that really stood out were the ones that had change management and communication components, and I mean strong components. But the ones that I'm really proud of, they had three key elements: change sponsorship, change leadership alignment, and a behavioral change element. So people and change have always fascinated me and intrigued me. And this is my purpose and passion. So my life is basically dedicated to leadership of change. And over the last 4 years, I've authored 12 books. I've developed my own change management framework, concept, models, assessments, and I'm now rolling out my online training and designing gamification. And I'm developing leaders, both their knowledge and their skills. And I think to finish off, where am I now? I find my passion. And when your work is your passion and your purpose, then it no longer feels like work.
How interesting. And I wanted to ask you, before we start talking about leadership of change, how do you define leadership of change, and how is this different from transformation?
So there's a couple of questions there. So how do I define? I'll define how I define leadership of change, and then where I am in that spectrum. So my leadership change really encompasses change models, concepts, frameworks, depictions, templates, and checklists that people can use, a roadmap, a glossary. And basically the center of that is a framework, which is about implementing change. And I probably focus on 5 main areas: change leadership implementation, employee change adoption, behavioral change, because sometimes behavioral change is very important, if not extremely important, and then the leadership teams and the sponsorship. So that's what it's all about. And it's all about improving that leadership of change in organizations and the leaders that deliver that. The other question you asked was the second part of that question.
How is this different from transformation?
Well, I think it's the same. The tools for change help change, transformation, and improvement or operational excellence. I think the difference between change and transformation is change is an incremental improvement to an organization, while transformation is a massive and fundamental change to the way the organization operates. And it just takes better leadership, and especially around the change. And I think companies have to be aware more of their organization for capacity.
You also say that you believe in change waits for no leader. Help me understand this and give me an example.
So throughout my career, I've always seen it, I think leaders have got 3 choices in change. If they're implementing change, they can do unmanaged change, reactive change, or managed change. And I think a lot of leaders in an organization are overwhelmed by day-to-day operations, Ash. That's their main focus. And even when they plan for operational day-to-day work, and they try to say, well, I'm going to focus on change, other work comes into the system and keeps them fully focused on normal day-to-day operations. So they tend to let the change team or an external consultant do that change. So how do I look at that? Well, I think leaders have three choices when they implement a change. They can do unmanaged change, which is really about focusing on normal day-to-day operations and letting, as I said, a consultant really work with the change. And what usually happens is here, the leaders of the organization are focused on day-to-day operations. They don't give any good resources to the change team. They don't give the change team any actually agenda time in the organization. So the change team implements the change. You get a lot of disruption and you get low benefits because the change isn't implemented. You haven't released people for training. You haven't got the organization aligned. You haven't agenda time. When you implement the change, you haven't picked the right time. The other one is reactive change. The leaders say, well, we're going to focus on normal day-to-day operations. We're going to let the change team work away on its own. But if they start to fail, then we'll go in and help them. So the change team works on its own. They don't get the best people. They don't get the resources. They implement the change. Performance drops, and it always drops because people are learning new processes, new tools. And then the leaders say, right, we need to stop our focus on normal data operations and start to help the change team. And the performance will improve, and it might even go better than it was before because unmanaged change, it might even get there. And you'll get a return on investment, but you won't get the benefits of sustainable change that you basically planned for in your portfolio projects or your strategy at the start of the year. So I talk about managed change, and that's my preferred option. So we basically need the leaders to say from day one, we're going to focus on normal day-to-day operations and change. We understand normal day-to-day operations is very important for creating the revenue today. But if we don't get the change right, there'll be no revenue for tomorrow. So we split our work. We give some of the good people in our team, which is very hard for leaders to do, over to the change team because you need good people in the change team, and they work together. They pick the time when the change is implemented in the organization. They make sure people are ready, the new systems are up and running, the people have been trained. They pick the go live time. You'll still get that little downturn in performance because people are learning new ways of working, new systems, new processes, but it'll be very short. So the disruption to the organization is minimal. And then because everybody's working and synchronized, that return on investment starts to come in. We get that improved performance. And I think that's very important for leaders to do. It's a difficult thing because I think in change, leaders sometimes have the most to lose. If they don't be seen to be involved in the employees will not think it's important and they'll lose it. And it also requires a different set of skills and knowledge, which not everybody has, and it doesn't come natural to everybody.
Well said. When I was reading about you and your book, you also refer to three typical approaches that organizations and leaders choose while implementing organizational change. Can you please share your insights?
So I've talked about the three approaches there before about the organizational leaders implementing change. This is more about, the change team and where they sit in the spectrum. So correct. If I draw a spectrum across, and this is it, change professionals, we all have a choice in the spectrum. So over the left-hand side, we've got employee support. In the middle, we've got employee adoption. And then on the right-hand side, we've got what I talk about, change implementation, program implementation, supported by the sponsor and by the leadership team. Let me talk about the first approach, which is employee support. We live in the age of the employee, and employee collaboration is very important, especially after COVID and the Great Resignation. So we need to support these employees, so that when they move through the change transition, it's a happy experience. We look at mindfulness, we look at burnout, we make sure they're included. The advantage is that it enhances the employee change transition experience and makes the employee feel good. The disadvantage is that unless that activity or the activities that they're doing or the consultants doing with them, unless they're linked and supported by leaders, these efforts only provide temporary benefits. So I'm all in for all the workshops and working together in teams, but it has to be linked to the strategy and the leaders have to be involved.
Very interesting.
The second approach is change adoption, and that's very important. And that's taking the employees through that process of adoption. And my process was, you give them awareness about the change, you give them understanding, you involve them in the change. It's a collaboration. Then you build their new skills, and then you keep them motivated. And that's extremely important. The advantage is this is you're fully supporting the employees through that engagement, that change transition, and that's where you get your benefits. If you get full employee adoption, then you'll maximize your benefits and you'll have a sustainable change. The disadvantages again are, unless the leaders are directly involved in the adoption process, the change team will compete against normal day-to-day operations, I've said before, for critical resources, and they'll actually be doing stuff that's not aligned with the leaders. So it mightn't maximize the benefits of the change further down the line. The third approach is where I work, my preferred approach. That's leadership, sponsorship, and implementation. So this is about getting effective and proactive sponsorship and leadership alignment, and ensuring that the leadership they know their responsibilities during this. And when I get these things together, I see successful change. So the advantages of up here is the leaders control the organization's resources and agenda time. And if you work with these guys and you get them engaged and they work with you, you will get successful change. The disadvantage of this, and why maybe a lot of change people stay in the other two areas, is you will come across narcissistic leaders. They will be indifferent delegators. They will be silo-focused leaders, and they mightn't want to support you. And if you're a timid guy and you don't want to get into confrontation, even if it's mild confrontation, a lot of people want to stay away from there. But I've been an internal, as I said earlier, I've been an internal and external consultant, and you can still challenge leaders respectfully. But and that's why the sponsor is so important to keep these lined. So those are the three.
Fascinating.
Three areas of the spectrum.
Fascinating. Thank you for sharing these. Going on, what are the 5 key questions you ask CEOs and their leadership teams at the start of a change journey?
Yeah. So again, I've learned this a few years ago. Leadership alignment is so important. If I go into an organization, leaders, as I said, are focused on normal day-to-day operations. They will have strategic priorities. And you're coming along with a change on top of that. So it's very difficult. So I think the first thing, I call it day zero alignment. So the 5 questions I ask a CEO and the leaders. 1, do you understand your organization's change history? So I do an assessment. I look back at certain things like, were the employees involved in the change? Was their workload considered? Had we a sponsor? And this gives me data. And then I ask them the second question, do you have a vision? Because a leader can't lead a change and then say to the consultant or the change team, please create a vision. They have to have that change vision.
Right.
And then they have to be aligned on their strategic objectives. That's a third thing. So the CEO, I'll sit down and talk to him, and they say, well, we've got 10 objectives, maybe too many. They might even have 20. And they say, here are they ranked from 1 to 10. And I'll go and talk to each one of those leaders, and they'll have different objectives. So it's aligning on those strategic objectives, and then where does change fit? And then I think high-performing team. To deliver change, you need to be a high-performing team. So I work with them in terms of their conflict in the team. We look at some sort of different models. Are they honest with each other? Are they working together? Are they sharing critical resources? Is there a leader in there that's got a silo mentality, that's not sharing resources with his peers and also with the change team? And then the last part of that process is I develop them. Well, I ask them if you've got change leadership skills and knowledge, and they think it's the same as normal day operations, and it's not. It's quite different. So that's one thing I ask. That's the 5 key questions.
Yeah. Thank you. You also have spoken about the importance of the leadership in successful change implementation. My question is, what are the change responsibilities during organizational change?
So the first thing I think the leaders have to be is proactive and effective throughout that change, and they've got to lead. There's 3 things I ask them usually to do as responsibilities. So when I implement a change, my methodology is usually plan, execute, and sustain. So the first part of that is really, to articulate a vision. So they've got to go out and articulate a vision with their people. The second part of that is they have to model a new way. You can't sit in your office and tell everybody, please do as I say, without showing the new way. So you've got to model a new way. And when employees see that, they see that this is the new way of working, and they tend to follow that. And then the last thing, intervention. You've got to intervene to ensure sustainable change in the last phase, or it won't become sustainable. So if you see an employee, they're not following a new way, then you've got to intervene. You've got to go and say, listen, we've changed the way we're working. We've transformed the business. This is the new way. Please do it. And that has to be done respectfully and politely, but it has to be firm as well. And then I suppose part of that is if somebody's doing the right thing, then go and congratulate them and thank them for working the new way.
The next question is that, you also write about a tiered approach to change management. What are some of these tiers and how are these implemented?
A tiered approach. So I usually follow a framework. So I follow a 10-step framework, and that suits all the models. So whether it's a sponsorship model, a leadership model, and again, that follows the plan to change, execute the change, and sustain the change. So that framework starts off with, and these are things I've learned when I wrote my first book, Change Management Fables. I look back, where were all the mistakes I've seen? And I picked out the top 10 at that time. And there's others, Ash. Believe me, there's others. And the first one is change leadership or change alignment with the strategy. Is our change program aligned with the strategy? And make sure it's clearly aligned and it's going to give the biggest benefits, because a lot of organizations do change and implementation or transformations that are not really going to impact the bottom line. So that's the first thing. Make sure it's aligned. Make sure it's went through some sort of portfolio analysis to say we're going to get benefits on. The second one is the sponsorship and team. I learned a long time ago, like, no matter how good I am, I pictured like a three-legged stool, Ash. If a three-legged stool, I'm one of the legs. My team is the second leg and the sponsor's the third leg. If I don't have that sponsor and I'm on a two-legged stool, I'll balance for a while, but I'll eventually fail. So you have to have that sponsor. That sponsor's got credibility and authority, who lead and challenge the other leaders. So that's important. So get your sponsor and your resources in place. The third thing I mentioned already, do a change history assessment. Find out what the data is telling you. The fourth thing is then create a detailed change plan. It's not a communication plan. It has to be a change implementation plan. And that's your 4 steps of your plan phase. Then we move into execute. So the first stage is communication. How are you going to communicate it? You know from your life, you can never over communicate. So communicate that. And then once you're starting to get ready for the change, start assessing the change. Have we put all the things in place for the change to be successful? Have we trained the people? Have we got a plan for all those? And then the other one's manage resistance, because you're always going to get resistance. No matter if you think the project or the change is good for everybody, there will be people that have had bad experience with change before and they won't want to do it. And then the 8th step is probably, develop those new skills and behaviors. So when you turn on the new way of working, the people have those skills. And as I said earlier, sometimes the behaviors are very important. And that's those 4 steps of execute. The last 2 steps of this tiered approach or framework are then sustain. And a lot of programs or teams don't get to this stage, but the last 2 are really, the first one is to close the program, to close it properly, and make sure that it's clearly somebody's going to take ownership of the project going forward, that somebody's going to calculate the benefits, that the benefits are going to be part of the organization's scorecard. So it's not just a post-it that you see somebody getting responsibility. That has to be a controlled process through governance and signed off by the sponsor and the senior leadership of the organization. And then we're into sustain. How are you going to sustain that? That's the last step. So how's it aligned with the employee's individual scorecard? Who's going to measure those benefits going forward? And what happens if we don't follow the new way of working?
Very good. Thank you. My next question is, that based on all my own experience, most leaders prefer status quo or status quo ante. How do you persuade leaders to change and transform?
Yeah. So I should say, first of all, don't take on bad business.
Okay.
If you think that they're not going to transform, then I don't think you should take it. A typical question or typical response I get from a leadership team when I go to them, and I say, guys, we need to spend time. We need to prepare for the change. We need to go through that leadership alignment process, which I've just spoken about. And a typical response I get, well, Peter, the problem's not with us, it's with the employees.
Yes.
And if you start getting that, and you can have a debate about it, but if you're getting that reaction and they think it's the employees below them, then don't take on that business. But I touched on it earlier, why the leaders don't really want to go there. I think there's 3 main reasons. And I'll give a bit more detail. In many cases, the leader's the most to lose. They've got a higher wage than everybody else. It's a bigger impact on them because they have to implement it and follow it. I think the second one is, they're probably struggling with their current workload. So they're probably working many hours a day. They're getting up early. They're working at the weekends. I was a manager before. You're probably getting, sometimes if you've got an operation that's 24 hours, you get calls in the middle of the night and somebody comes along and says, well, now we're going to change. It's the last thing you want to hear, Ash.
Correct.
And the other one is, the third one, as I mentioned earlier, it's a different set of skills. So it's not common sense and it doesn't come naturally to everybody. So they've got to take time out to learn a new way, to articulate a vision, as I've mentioned earlier. that takes a special skill to stand up and to articulate a compelling vision that will inspire your employees to follow the change that you're trying to make. It's quite difficult. So, with all those things, with all that, you've lots to lose. You're getting extra workload, and it's a different skill set. Wow, it puts a lot of them off it, and they try to say, "Well, I'm going to subcontract this out," and you can't.
Yeah. Well said. And my last question to you on change, and then I want to move to your other books. Where does accountability for change lie?
I think it's a change sponsor. So once I identify a sponsor, and I said that sponsor's got credibility within the organization, and they have to have power and authority as well. So it's like a judge when the other leaders are going up in front and the sponsor's making them do things, and he's asking, well, did you give resources? Did you give agenda time? Are you working in a silo, or are you just delegating this change? Yeah. So I think it's ultimately the sponsor that's appointed by the CEO, and that sponsor has to be proactive and effective as well. And they've got to work with the leadership team. So they're going to be responsible for that change and for the leadership making the change happen. So when I'm having that first chat with the sponsor, I ask the sponsor to do 3 things. Again, following the plan, the execute and sustain, that it's aligned with the leadership responsibility. So they're going to be the say. They're going to be the main person of that project. They're going to talk about the vision. They're going to make sure everybody in the organization and even external stakeholders know this is where we're going. So they do that communication. And during that conversation, I say, everybody in the organization and the stakeholders, external, are going to know that you're responsible for this. So to answer your question, I make them very clear to start. This is not putting your hand up and said, I'm taking a cushy position. You're doing this position. You're taking the leadership role as a sponsor of this change, and you're responsible to fails. If it fails, I'll let everybody know. And it's quite a difficult conversation. And then their other responsibilities are really, to support the organization through that, to make sure the leaders release resources. I've worked in operations, and so if a leader will keep promising you resources, but in day-to-day operations, problems come up. You do not want to release resources. So the sponsor has got to go and have that chat and make sure the change team support it. And he's got to educate the organization and change. And then the last one, again, is sustain the change. So he's really responsible for making sure we've got a handover from the change team to the operations, so it becomes normal day-to-day operations and it's sustainable. So the answer to your question, in short, the sponsor. So it's a very important role.
Well said. Thank you. I'm now going to move to your books. We've spoken about one of your books, which is Leadership of Change. We don't have too much time, but you told me that you finished 12 books in 4 years. Tell me a little bit about your other books.
So I think I started with fables. I talked about, they're all leadership of change. I started with the change management fables. And again, I look back and I created that 10-step framework, as you said, the tiered approach. And then within that, I learned, I mentioned already, there's other important books. From the fables, I created a pocket guide. So that was basically building the methodology out. And then I went into the handbook, much thicker, more assessments, more tools, and based around that 10-step framework. Then the next book I done was leadership. So that's the leadership book. How do you lead change? And I talked about that in the 3 areas: articulate a vision, model a new way, and intervene to get sustainable change. Then I done adoption, which I've touched on. Then I done a book on behavior. Behaviors. Any challenges I have now around implementation, it's around employee and leadership behavior. And then the last one, which you just talked about again, is sponsorship. Fantastic. So those 7 textbooks are the basically core. And then I also talked about, developing skills and knowledge. So then I've created 5 gamification books. So the gamification books basically take the main book, but they put it into a 1-day workshop at a very minimum where people follow that methodology. But what I like about gamification, I'm not a big fan of PowerPoint slides. I hope I have time to finish this. When you sit in a room, PowerPoint slides, you just get knowledge. But when you do gamification, you get the skills as well. So for each one of those books, it's got a case study with 14 stakeholders from different levels of the organization. And you and your team are the leader of change. So you play those 10 rounds or whatever it is, if it's or 3 rounds, depending on which model you're using, and you implement change. You pick different concepts and you see how the stakeholders react. And the stakeholders will react. They react neutral, positive, or negatively, and you get that feedback, and you get that awareness that you're not going to get in a classroom, and you get that discussion with the other leaders. And the main advantage of that, Ash, is when you walk out of that workshop the next day, you've got skills and knowledge to start implementing change.
Very interesting. And my last question to you, Peter, and this is for the thousands of people who will listen to our conversation, and this is a young audience that is going to be listening to our conversation, what would you say are 3 lessons on change or change management you would want our viewers and listeners to take away?
So I'm going to put a foundation to that. If you want to be great at change, I think you've got to have the experience. So I traveled all around the world, and I never sat in the office. I've been in many countries. I've been in the Caspian Sea, offshore in the Caspian Sea. I've been in the North Sea, offshore. I've tried to go to the location. So get that grounding, get a accreditation with change management. Some sort of professional qualification.
Yeah.
Those are key things that you have to do.
Yeah.
Make sure you get those.
So
the 3 bits of advice I would say is, and I've touched on really, don't take on bad business.
Don't take on, sorry?
Don't take on bad business.
Okay.
I go back to the earlier question.
Yeah.
If you engage a change team, and that they're saying it's not us, it's the problem, it's the people below. If you feel you're not going to get proactive and effective leadership and engagement, don't take it on. Now, people will say, I don't have the luxury to do that. Well, then try and break that down as much as you can, or call the leader out.
Correct.
But don't walk away from it. I think the second one is, I've touched on already, the 3-legged stool. If you don't have a sponsor, the stool's going to fall over. It's going to fall over eventually, no matter how well you balance it. So make sure you get a sponsor. And then I've touched on the other one. You talked about the tiered approach. You need a framework to implement change. It's not just, let's go with a communication plan. It has to be detailed. And it starts with defining that strategy.
Very interesting.
Are our change programs aligned to the strategy? Are they going to improve the organization? That's my 3 bits. Don't take on bad business, get a sponsor, and follow some sort of
framework. Very interesting. And on that note, Peter, and your incredible pieces of learnings, which you preceded with, you must have the experience to change, and you need to get accreditation. And then you said, don't take on bad business, get a sponsor, and have a framework that you want to work within for the change. Thank you so much for speaking to me about your own incredible journey, about so many different aspects of change, and about your book, Leadership of Change, and of course, your other books as well. Thank you again for speaking to me, and good luck.
Thank you very much, Ash. Really enjoyed it. Thank you for having me on.
Thank you for listening to the Brand Called You videocast and podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website, www.tbcy.in, to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for The Brand Called You.